May 7, 1945. Foreign Minister Togo Shigeru sat in his Tokyo office as the telegram was decoded before him. The words came through in fragments, each one heavier than the last. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. He was 52 years old, and he'd spent the last 3 decades navigating Japan's foreign policy through increasingly treacherous waters. But this changed everything. The Reich that had seemed invincible in 1940, that had conquered France in 6 weeks and pushed the gates of Moscow, had collapsed. The alliance that Japan had bet its future on, the tripartite pact that was supposed to reshape the world order, meant nothing now. Japan stood alone. Togo reached for the phone to call Prime Minister Suzuki. His hand, he noticed, was steady. Years of diplomatic training had taught him to control such visible signs of distress, but his mind was racing through the implications, each one darker than the last. Across Tokyo, in the War Ministry, General Anami Korechika was receiving the same news. His reaction was different. The 57-year-old War Minister stood at his window, looking out over a city that bore the scars of American firebombing. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash. The smell of smoke still hung in the air from the latest raids, but Anami's jaw was set. Germany's surrender, he would later tell his staff, changed nothing. Germany had fought a 2-front war across vast European distances. Germany had weak allies and internal dissent. Germany's situation bore no resemblance to Japan's. Japan was an island fortress. Japan had 2 million troops on the home islands, ready to fight to the last man. Japan had thousands of aircraft, many of them reserved for kamikaze attacks that would devastate any invasion fleet. Japan had terrain that would turn every beach, every valley, every city into a killing ground for American forces. Germany's surrender, Anami believed, was Germany's failure, not Japan's. The Supreme War Council, the Big Six who effectively controlled Japan's fate, met the following morning. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. These 6 men, the Emperor's closest military and civilian advisors, had been meeting almost daily as the war situation deteriorated. Now they faced a question that couldn't be avoided. Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro, at 77, the oldest man in the room, called the meeting to order. He'd been an admiral in his younger days, had survived an assassination attempt during the February 26th incident 9 years earlier. 4 bullets had hit him then. He'd been left for dead. He survived, but he walked with a cane now and spoke with deliberate slowness. "Gentlemen," he said, "we must discuss the German situation and what it means for our own position." Foreign Minister Togo spoke first. His voice was measured, diplomatic, but the urgency beneath it was unmistakable. The Reich's collapse leaves us without allies. The full weight of Allied military power can now be directed against us. The Americans, the British, the possibility of Soviet entry into the Pacific War. We must consider our options carefully. He didn't say the word surrender. Not yet. But everyone in the room understood what he meant. War Minister Anami leaned forward. "Our situation is fundamentally different from Germany's. We have strategic advantages they never possessed. Our island geography means any invasion must come by sea, where our kamikaze forces will exact a terrible price. Our people are united in a way Germany's never were. We have prepared for the decisive battle. The Ketsugo operation that will make the Americans reconsider their demand for unconditional surrender." Navy Minister Yonai Mitsumasa, 65 years old and increasingly pessimistic about Japan's chances, spoke quietly. "The American industrial capacity is overwhelming. They're producing ships faster than we can sink them, aircraft faster than we can shoot them down. Every day our situation grows worse, not better." Chief of Army General Staff Umezu Yoshijiro cut him off. "The decisive battle has not yet been fought. Once American forces land on our shores and face the reality of what it will cost to conquer Japan, they will negotiate. No democracy will accept the casualties that taking these islands will require. Chief of Naval General Staff Toyoda Soemu nodded agreement. Our naval forces may be depleted, but our coastal defenses are formidable. Every beach is fortified, every approach is mined. We have suicide boats, human torpedoes, underwater demolition swimmers. The invasion will be a bloodbath. The meeting went on for 3 hours. No consensus emerged. The room was split, as it had been for weeks, between those who saw the need to seek peace and those who insisted Japan could still achieve acceptable terms through one final, decisive battle. But there was one thing they all agreed on. The public could not know about their divisions. The people had to believe their leaders were united, determined, resolved to fight on, regardless of what happened in Europe. That afternoon, Prime Minister Suzuki held a press conference. The room was packed with journalists, both Japanese and representatives from neutral countries who would carry his words to the world. "The surrender of Germany," Suzuki said, reading from a prepared statement, "has no bearing on Japan's resolve to prosecute this war to a victorious conclusion. Our situation is entirely different from that of our former ally. We possess advantages of geography and national unity that Germany lacked. The Japanese people remain steadfast in their determination to defend the homeland against any invasion." He paused, looking up from his notes. "We will fight on alone if necessary. The spirit of our people has never been stronger. The path ahead may be difficult, but we will prevail." The words were defiant. They had to be. But those who knew Suzuki well, who'd worked with him for years, noticed something in his delivery. A flatness, a lack of conviction. He was reading words, not speaking his beliefs. In the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito received the news of Germany's surrender with visible concern. At 44, he'd been emperor for 19 years, had watched his country rise to dominate East Asia and then begin its slow, grinding descent toward defeat. He called for Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal Kido Koichi, his closest advisor. They spoke in private, their conversation unrecorded, but those who saw the emperor afterward noted his troubled expression. Hirohito had been raised to believe in the divinity of his position, but he was also a man who studied marine biology, who understood scientific method and evidence. And the evidence was increasingly clear. Japan was losing. The question was no longer whether Japan could win, but whether it would be completely destroyed before accepting the inevitable. But the emperor couldn't simply order surrender. The Japanese system didn't work that way. He was supposed to reign, not rule, to act as the voice of consensus among his advisors, not to impose his will against their recommendations. For him to intervene directly would require extraordinary circumstances, a deadlock so complete that only imperial decision could break it. That deadlock was forming. But it wasn't there yet. Meanwhile, in the streets of Tokyo, in Osaka, in Nagoya, in every city that hadn't been reduced to rubble by American firebombing, people heard the news of Germany's surrender with mixed emotions. Some felt a spike of fear. If mighty Germany could fall, what chance did Japan have? Others felt a strange relief. At least the uncertainty was over. Now they knew. It was Japan alone against the world. Many simply felt numb. After years of war, after so many defeats disguised as strategic withdrawals, after so many cities burned, so many sons and brothers and fathers lost, the news was just one more piece of bad information in an endless stream of bad information. Kimura Setsuko, a 23-year-old factory worker in Yokohama, heard about the German surrender from her supervisor. She was operating a lathe, making parts for aircraft that would probably be used in kamikaze attacks. Her hands kept moving as she processed the news. "Does this mean the war will end soon?" she asked. Her supervisor, an older man who'd fought in China, shook his head. "It means we fight harder. Germany was weak, we are not." But that night, lying on her futon in the dormitory, she shared with 30 other women, Setsuko allowed herself to think thoughts that could get her arrested if she spoke them aloud. If Germany, with all its power and technology, couldn't win, how could Japan? The Americans had more of everything: more planes, more ships, more tanks, more bombs, more men, more food, more fuel, more of everything that mattered in modern war. She thought about her brother, who died at Leyte Gulf 6 months earlier. She thought about her father, conscripted at age 48 and sent to Manchuria. She thought about the rations that got smaller every week, the air raid sirens that sent them running to shelters almost every night, the constant exhaustion that had become normal. How much longer could this go on? But she kept those thoughts to herself. In public, she maintained the expected face: determination, resolve, readiness to sacrifice everything for final victory. Everyone wore that face. It was required. But behind it, in the privacy of their own minds, more and more Japanese were beginning to ask questions they couldn't voice. Back in the government offices, the debate continued. Foreign Minister Togo began preparing a diplomatic initiative. His plan was to approach the Soviet Union, which had maintained neutrality in the Pacific War under a non-aggression pact signed in 1941. Perhaps, Togo reasoned, the Soviets could be persuaded to mediate peace terms. Japan would offer territorial concessions, economic agreements, anything to avoid unconditional surrender and the destruction of the imperial system. The Soviets, exhausted from their war with Germany, might welcome the chance to broker peace and gain influence in the Pacific. It was a desperate plan. It relied on Soviet goodwill that probably didn't exist. But it was something. A diplomatic avenue to explore while the military prepared for the decisive battle they insisted was coming. Togo drafted messages to the Japanese ambassador in Moscow. Feel out the Soviet position. Test their willingness to mediate. Buy time. War Minister Anami, meanwhile, was overseeing the buildup of forces for Operation Ketsugo, the plan to defend the home islands. The strategy was simple in concept, devastating in its implications. Every potential invasion beach was being fortified. Coastal artillery, machine gun nests, tank traps, mines by the thousands. When American forces landed, they would face a wall of fire. Behind the beaches, the defenses went deeper. Caves in the hillsides, bunkers connected by tunnels, positions that would have to be reduced one by one in brutal close combat. Every city would be defended street by street, house by house, room by room. And overhead, the kamikaze forces. Thousands of aircraft, many of them obsolete trainers and reconnaissance planes, but all capable of carrying a bomb and a determined pilot. The plan called for waves of suicide attacks that would overwhelm American air defenses through sheer numbers. The Americans, Anami calculated, would suffer casualties on a scale that would make Okinawa look like a minor skirmish. Tens of thousands dead in the first days, hundreds of thousands before any decisive outcome. The American public, already war-weary after years of fighting in Europe and the Pacific, would demand negotiations. It was a plan built on the willingness to sacrifice everything. Japanese military planners estimated that defending the home islands would cost millions of Japanese lives, military and civilian. But that was acceptable, they argued, if it preserved the national polity, the kokutai, the imperial system that defined Japan's identity. Better to die as Japanese than survive as something else. But there was a problem with this calculation, one that the military leadership either didn't see or refused to acknowledge. The plan assumed the Americans would invade conventionally, that they would play the game by rules the Japanese understood. What if they didn't? In New Mexico, at a site called Trinity, American scientists were preparing to test a weapon that would render all of Japan's defensive preparations meaningless. But the Japanese High Command knew nothing about this. Their intelligence services had failed to penetrate the Manhattan Project's security. So they planned for the battle they expected, not the war they were about to face. May turned to June. The battle for Okinawa ground on, a preview of what the fight for the home islands would look like. Japanese forces fought with suicidal determination. Kamikaze attacks sank dozens of American ships. American casualties mounted into the tens of thousands, but the Americans kept coming. They had the resources to absorb losses that would have broken any other nation, and slowly, methodically, they crushed Japanese resistance on Okinawa. The Supreme War Council met again and again. The same arguments, the same deadlock. Togo and Yonai pushing cautiously for diplomatic options. Hanami, Umezu, and Toyoda insisting on the decisive battle. Suzuki in the middle, trying to hold together a government that was fracturing under the weight of impossible choices. And the Emperor, watching, waiting, unable to act until the moment was right. The American firebombing campaign intensified. On the night of May 25th, Tokyo burned again. Hundreds of B-29 bombers dropped incendiaries across the city. 16 square miles turned to ash. Thousands died. Kimura Setsuko's factory was hit. She survived because she was in a shelter, but when she emerged the next morning, the building where she'd worked was gone. Just twisted metal and charred concrete. She was reassigned to debris clearing. 12 hours a day, she and thousands of other women moved rubble, recovered bodies, tried to clear paths through the destruction. The work was backbreaking, the scenes horrific, but she did it without complaint. What else was there to do? In the government offices, officials prepared contingency plans for moving the capital to Nagano, in the mountains west of Tokyo. If the Americans invaded, if Tokyo fell, the government would retreat inland and continue the fight from there. They were planning for a war that could go on for years. A war that would reduce Japan to rubble but preserve its essential character, its spirit, its identity as an independent nation. The alternative, unconditional surrender, was unthinkable. It meant occupation, foreign control, the possible abolition of the imperial system, the destruction of everything that made Japan Japan, or so they told themselves. But in private conversations, in hushed tones behind closed doors, some were beginning to question this logic. Foreign Minister Togo spoke carefully to allies in the government. We must consider what unconditional surrender actually means. Perhaps there is room for negotiation about the emperor's status. Perhaps the Americans can be made to understand that preserving the imperial system serves their interests as well as ours. It was dangerous talk. If the military hardliners heard him speaking this way, they might act. The February 26th incident, the attempted coup in 1936, was still fresh in memory. Young officers who believed their leaders were betraying Japan's sacred mission had murdered government officials and nearly overthrown the government. It could happen again. Hanami and the military leadership might not order such action, but they might not stop it either if they believed the civilian government was preparing to surrender. So Togo moved carefully, feeling out positions, building consensus slowly, preparing the ground for the moment when peace would become possible. That moment was coming, though no one yet knew how it would arrive. June became July. At Potsdam, in occupied Germany, Allied leaders met to discuss the final phase of the war. President Truman, Prime Minister Churchill, and Premier Stalin gathered to coordinate strategy. On July 26th, they issued a declaration calling for Japan's unconditional surrender. The terms were clear: complete disarmament, Allied occupation, war criminals would be tried, the Japanese government would be reformed. But crucially, the declaration didn't explicitly demand the abolition of the imperial system. That omission was deliberate, a small opening that some in the American government hoped might make surrender more palatable to the Japanese. The Japanese government received the Potsdam Declaration through neutral channels. The Supreme War Council met to discuss their response. War Minister Anami's position was immediate and uncompromising. We must reject this. Any response other than rejection will be seen as weakness. will encourage the Americans to increase their demands. Foreign Minister Togo argued for a more nuanced approach. We should neither accept nor reject immediately. We should seek clarification about the emperor's status, use this as an opening for negotiation. But Prime Minister Suzuki, under pressure from the military, made a fateful decision. At a press conference, he used the word mokusatsu to describe the government's response to the Potsdam Declaration. Mokusatsu, a word that could mean withhold comment or ignore or treat with silent contempt, depending on context and interpretation. The Western press translated it as rejection. Japan, they reported, had spurned the Allied peace offer. The war would continue. Whether Suzuki intended that interpretation is unclear. Perhaps he was trying to maintain ambiguity, to buy time for diplomatic initiatives. Perhaps he was genuinely rejecting the terms. Perhaps he simply chose a word poorly, not realizing how it would be understood. But the effect was the same. The Americans took it as a refusal to surrender. In New Mexico, the Trinity test had been successful. The atomic bomb worked. President Truman was informed that the weapon would be ready for use against Japan within weeks. The Japanese High Command knew none of this. They continued planning for the decisive battle. They continued hoping that Soviet mediation might provide a diplomatic escape. They continued believing they had time to prepare, time to negotiate, time to find a path between unconditional surrender and national suicide. They were wrong. On August 6th, a B-29 bomber called Enola Gay dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima. The city ceased to exist. 70,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the following days and weeks from radiation and burns. The Japanese High Command struggled to understand what had happened. Initial reports were confused, contradictory. A single bomb that destroyed an entire city. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. Hiroshima was gone. The Supreme War Council met in emergency session. Even now, even after this, they were divided. War Minister Anami argued that Japan could endure even atomic attacks if it meant preserving the national polity. The Americans couldn't have many such bombs. Japan could absorb the losses and still fight on. Foreign Minister Togo was horrified. How many cities must be destroyed? How many hundreds of thousands must die? We must seek peace now, immediately, before more are killed. But still there was no consensus. The deadlock held. 3 days later, on August 9th, two things happened that finally broke the impasse. First, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The diplomatic initiative that Togo had been pursuing, the hope that the Soviets might mediate peace, evaporated in hours. The Red Army crashed through Japanese defenses, overwhelming the Kwantung Army that had once been Japan's most elite force. Second, another atomic bomb fell, this time on Nagasaki. Another city destroyed. Another 70,000 dead. Japan was out of time, out of options, out of everything except the choice between surrender and annihilation. That night, August 9th into August 10th, the Supreme War Council met again. The same arguments, the same deadlock. 3 for continuing the war, 3 for seeking peace. Prime Minister Suzuki made an unprecedented decision. He would ask the emperor to break the tie. In the early hours of August 10th, in an underground bunker beneath the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito spoke. His voice was quiet, strained with emotion, but his words were clear. I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad, and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. He paused, gathering himself. The time has come to bear the unbearable. It was over. The emperor had spoken. Japan would surrender. But even then, even after the emperor's decision, there was resistance. Young officers in the war ministry attempted a coup, trying to seize the imperial palace and prevent the surrender announcement. They were stopped by senior officers loyal to the emperor's decision. War Minister Anami, who had argued so forcefully for continuing the fight, committed seppuku on the morning of August 15th. He could not live with the surrender he had opposed, but he would not oppose the emperor's will. At noon on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast to the Japanese people for the first time in history. The recording was scratchy, his language formal and archaic, but the message was clear. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Kimura Setsuko heard the broadcast in the ruins of her neighborhood. She stood among the rubble with hundreds of others, listening to their emperor's voice coming from a loudspeaker. When it ended, there was silence. Then, slowly, people began to weep. Not from joy, not from relief. From a complex mix of emotions that had no simple name. Grief for all that was lost. Shame at defeat. Relief that the dying would stop. Fear of what came next. She looked around at the destroyed city, at the exhausted faces of her neighbors, at the children who'd known nothing but war their entire lives. It was over. They had survived. That was something. In the government offices, the officials who'd spent months deadlocked over surrender now worked to implement it. Arrangements for the occupation, preparations for the surrender ceremony, orders to military forces across Asia to lay down their arms. Foreign Minister Togo, who'd argued for peace since May, felt no satisfaction. Too many had died. Too much had been destroyed. If they'd accepted reality sooner, if they'd surrendered after Germany fell, how many lives might have been saved? But that was the past. The question now was the future. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender. General MacArthur accepted on behalf of the Allied powers. The war that had begun with Pearl Harbor, that had killed millions across the Pacific, that had consumed Japan's cities in fire and ended with atomic bombs, was finally, officially over. The Japanese High Command's reaction to Germany's surrender in May had been defiance. We will fight on alone. We will achieve victory through determination and sacrifice. We are different from Germany. 4 months later, Japan surrendered unconditionally, just as Germany had. The decisive battle they'd planned for never happened. The Soviet mediation they'd hoped for never materialized. The American willingness to negotiate they'd counted on never appeared. They'd been wrong about everything except one thing. The Japanese people's capacity for endurance and sacrifice was extraordinary. But that capacity, it turned out, wasn't enough. Not against atomic bombs. Not against the combined might of nations that could replace every loss and keep coming. The question that haunted some of them afterward was simple and terrible. If they'd known in May what they learned by August, if they'd understood that Germany's fall was a preview of their own, how many lives could have been saved? But history doesn't offer such clarity in the moment. Only in retrospect do the paths not taken become visible. In May 1945, facing Germany's surrender, the Japanese High Command made the choices that seemed right to them, based on their understanding, their beliefs, their hopes. Those choices led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to Soviet invasion, to unconditional surrender, to occupation and transformation. They'd said they would fight on alone. And they did, for 3 more months, until there was nothing left to fight with and no way to continue. The war was over. The reckoning had just begun.